Four-star general's fist slammed against the reinforced glass of the ICU observation window hard enough to crack it. Inside, his 17-year-old daughter was screaming, not in pain, but in pure animal terror. Her hands clawed at the air, searching for something she couldn't see, had never been able to see. The machines around her bed shrieked in rhythm with her panic. Security was 3 seconds from bursting through the door when a voice cut through the chaos, quiet, steady, impossibly calm. "Sir, I found something in her eyes." Everyone turned. The speaker was young, maybe 26, wearing scrubs 2 sizes too big, and an ID badge so faded her name was barely visible. Tessa Morgan. The float nurse nobody remembered hiring, the one who refilled supplies and stayed late without being asked. The one senior staff walked past like she was furniture. She stood there holding a penlight and a patient chart, her hand trembling just enough to betray that she knew exactly how insane this moment was. The general's face was stone. "What did you just say?" Tessa swallowed. Her supervisor was already moving toward her, face white with fury, but she didn't look away from the glass. "I think," she said slowly, "your daughter doesn't have to be blind." The room went silent, not the comfortable kind, the kind that comes right before everything explodes. If you want to see how far a single voice can travel when the whole system wants it silenced, stay with me until the end. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story really goes. Tessa had been invisible for so long she'd almost started to believe that's what she was. Not literally. She showed up on the schedule, her badge scanned at the doors. Paychecks arrived every 2 weeks, direct deposit, no ceremony. But in the hallways of Ironvale Medical Center, in the trauma bays and ICU pods, and the glass-walled conference rooms where real decisions got made, she was a ghost. People looked through her, talked over her, forgot her name mid-sentence even when she was wearing it on her chest. It wasn't malicious. That would have been easier. Malice you could fight. This was something worse. Indifference so total it didn't even register as cruelty. Tessa told herself it didn't matter. She wasn't here to be seen. She was here to work. She'd made it through nursing school on scholarships and spite, survived clinical rotations under supervisors who thought she was too quiet, too young, too soft for the job. She'd proven them wrong by doing the one thing nobody else wanted to do, showing up. Every shift, every call, every mess. Ironvale Medical Center sat in the heart of Raven City like a fortress. 12 stories of steel and glass, helicopter pad on the roof, Level 1 trauma designation, the best neurosurgery wing in the region. Politicians got treated here. CEOs, the kind of people who didn't wait in lines. It wasn't the biggest hospital in the state, but it was the one that mattered. Tessa had been there 8 months, long enough to know where the good coffee was hidden, not long enough for anyone to care. She was restocking an exam room on the 4th floor when she first heard about the VIP patient. "Isolation suite, East Wing," one of the ER nurses said, voice low but buzzing with the kind of gossip that spread faster than an infection. "They're saying it's military, high level, daughter of someone seriously connected." "What's she in for?" someone else asked. "Not sure, but Wolf's handling it personally." Tessa's hands paused over a drawer of gauze. Dr. Adrian Wolf, Chief of Ophthalmology. 15 years at Ironvale, another 10 somewhere prestigious before that. Published researcher. Keynote speaker at international conferences. The kind of doctor who had his own parking spot and an assistant who answered his emails. Wolf didn't take regular patients anymore. If he was involved, it wasn't routine. Tessa finished stocking the room and moved on. She had 6 more to do before her shift ended, and she'd learned a long time ago not to get curious about things that weren't her business. But 2 days later, she was assigned to the East Wing. It wasn't a promotion, it was coverage. One of the regular ICU nurses had called in sick, and they needed a warm body to handle vitals, med checks, the grunt work that didn't require decisions. Tessa knew the drill. Keep your head down, don't ask questions. Don't touch anything you're not explicitly told to touch. The isolation suite was at the end of a hallway that felt too quiet. No overhead pages, no rolling gurneys, just thick doors with keypad locks and observation windows that could be frosted opaque with the press of a button. Tessa checked the chart outside the room. Patient name, Nora Hale. Age, 17. Diagnosis, congenital bilateral optic neuropathy. permanent vision loss since birth. She read it twice. Congenital. That meant genetic, structural. The kind of thing that didn't have a cure, only management. She'd seen cases like this in school, kids who'd never seen their parents' faces, who navigated the world through sound and texture and memory. Brutal, but stable. You adapted. You lived. Still, something about the notes felt off. There were gaps, referrals that led nowhere. Imaging reports from years ago that didn't match the recent ones. Like someone had been editing the story as they went. Tessa pushed the thought away. Not her business. She knocked lightly and stepped inside. The girl was sitting up in bed, hands folded in her lap, head tilted slightly to the left like she was listening to something no one else could hear. She was small for 17, delicate in a way that looked intentional, like she'd learned to take up less space to make people comfortable. Her eyes were open but unfocused, pale gray, unmoving. "Hi," Tessa said gently. "I'm Tessa. I'm one of the nurses. Just here to check your vitals." Nora's head turned toward her voice. "You're new." "To this wing, yeah." The other nurse. She talks louder, like I'm deaf and blind. Tessa smiled despite herself. "I'll try to keep it reasonable." She moved through the checklist. Blood pressure, pulse, oxygen levels. Everything normal, stable. The girl didn't flinch, didn't ask questions. She'd done this 1,000 times before. "How long have you been here?" Tessa asked. 4 days. They're running tests." Nora's voice was flat. "Same tests they always run? Same answers they always get?" Tessa hesitated. "You've been to a lot of hospitals?" 17 years worth. The bitterness in her tone was so sharp it could have drawn blood. Tessa finished the vitals and logged them. She should have left. Should have moved on to the next task. But something made her stop. "Can I ask you something?" Nora's expression didn't change. "Sure." "Do your eyes hurt, ever?" The girl frowned. "No, why?" "Any pressure? Sensitivity to light?" "I can't see light." "I know. But sometimes the nerves still react, even if the brain doesn't process it." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sometimes it feels like something's there, like a film. But the doctors say that's just phantom sensation. My brain making things up because it doesn't know what else to do." Tessa nodded slowly. "Got it, thanks." She left the room and stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the chart in her hands. Phantom sensation. Maybe, but maybe not. She pulled up the imaging files on the tablet. Scans from 3 years ago, then 2, then 6 months. She wasn't a radiologist, wasn't even close, but she'd spent enough time in ophthalmology rotations to recognize basic structures. Optic nerve, retina, cornea. And there, just barely visible on the most recent scan, something that didn't belong. A faint, irregular density sitting right over the optic nerve. Thin, membranous. It could have been artifact, a glitch in the imaging, a shadow, or it could have been real. Tessa's heart kicked hard against her ribs. She logged out of the file and walked back to the nurses' station, where 2 of the senior staff were talking in low voices. One of them glanced up as she approached. "You need something?" "I was just looking at the Hale file," Tessa said carefully. "There's a density on the latest MRI that—" "Not your case," the nurse cut in. "Wolf's handling it." "I know, but then let him handle it." The other nurse didn't even look up. Tessa stood there for a beat, feeling the familiar weight of being dismissed settle over her like a coat she couldn't take off. "Right," she said quietly. "Sorry." She went back to her work, restocked another room, changed another IV, smiled at a patient who didn't smile back. The shift crawled forward. But that night, alone in her apartment, she pulled up every medical journal she could access and searched for cases like Nora's. Congenital blindness, optic nerve abnormalities, misdiagnosis, reversible causes. She found 3 case studies, all rare, all involving a condition so obscure it didn't even have a common name, a congenital fibrous membrane that formed over the optic nerve in utero and persisted into adulthood, mimicking permanent neuropathy. In every case, removal of the membrane had restored vision. In every case, it had been missed for years. Tessa read until her eyes burned. Then she read some more. The next morning, she went back to the East Wing. Nora was asleep. Tessa checked her vitals again, logged them, and then did something she absolutely was not supposed to do. She pulled up the old records. Not just the recent scans, but the ones from when Nora was 5, 7, 10. She cross-referenced them with the clinical notes, the referral letters, the treatment plans. And she found it. A note from 12 years ago. Attending physician, Dr. Adrian Wolf. Observation. Possible membranous obstruction noted on imaging. Recommend surgical consultation. And then, 2 weeks later, a follow-up note. Further imaging inconclusive. No surgical intervention recommended. Diagnosis remains congenital optic neuropathy. Tessa stared at the screen until the words blurred. He'd seen it. 12 years ago, Wolf had seen it, flagged it, and then, what? Walked it back? Buried it? Her hands were shaking. She logged out, walked to the break room, poured coffee she didn't drink, tried to think. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. And if she was wrong, if she brought this up and it turned out to be nothing, she'd be finished. Not just ignored, fired, blacklisted. But if she was right, Tessa took a breath, then another. Then she went to find Dr. Wolf. She caught him outside the surgical wing, surrounded by residents and an attending who laughed too loud at everything he said. He was tall, mid-50s, silver hair combed back like a news anchor, expensive watch, shoes that cost more than her rent. "Dr. Wolf," she said. He didn't stop walking. "I'm in the middle of something. It's about Nora Hale." That got his attention. He stopped, turned. The residents went quiet. "Who are you?" "Tessa Morgan. I'm one of the nurses assigned to—" "I didn't ask for a nurse's opinion." The resident smirked. Tessa felt heat crawl up her neck, but she didn't back down. "I think there's something on her optic nerve, a membrane. It showed up on the MRI, and there's a note in her file from 12 years ago that—" "I'm aware of her file," Wolf said coldly, "and I'm aware of what's in it. Are you suggesting I missed something?" "I'm suggesting it might be worth another look." "Based on what? Your extensive experience in ophthalmology?" One of the residents actually laughed. Tessa's jaw tightened. "Based on the imaging and the case studies that show—" "Case studies." Wolf's voice could have frozen blood. "You've been here, what, 8 months? And you think you found something that an entire team of specialists missed?" "I'm not saying I know better. I'm saying you're saying you don't know your place." He stepped closer. "This is a teaching hospital, Miss Morgan. That means you learn. You don't diagnose. You don't theorize. You follow protocols and you stay in your lane. Do you understand?" The hallway was watching now. Other nurses, techs, a security guard who'd paused mid-stride. Tessa's voice came out quieter than she wanted. "Yes, sir." "Good." Wolf turned back to his residents. "Let's go." They left. The hallway emptied. Tessa stood there alone, hands clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. She went back to the east wing, back to Nora's room. The girl was awake now, staring at nothing. "Hey," Tessa said softly. "You're back." "Yeah." Tessa sat down in the chair by the bed. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "If there was a chance, even a small one, that you could see, would you want to know?" Nora's face didn't change. "They've been telling me that my whole life. Maybe next year, maybe the next surgery, maybe the next doctor. It's always maybe." "I know." "So no," Nora said. "I don't want another maybe. I want the truth." Tessa nodded. "Okay." She didn't say anything else. Just finished her shift, logged her notes, and went home. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, staring at the case studies, the scans, the notes. She thought about Wolf's face, the residents' laughter, the way the entire hospital had looked at her like she was a child playing dress-up. And then she thought about Nora, 17 years old, blind since birth, living in a world of maybes. Tessa opened a new email, addressed it to the hospital's patient advocacy office, attached the scans, the notes, the case studies. Her finger hovered over the send button. If she did this, there was no going back. Wolf would know. The administration would know. She'd be marked as a troublemaker, a liability, someone who didn't follow the chain of command. But if she didn't, She hit send. The next morning, she got called into the nursing supervisor's office. What the hell were you thinking? The supervisor, a woman named Carol with 30 years of experience and zero patience for drama, dropped a printed copy of the email on the desk like it was evidence of a crime. You went over Wolf's head. You filed a formal concern about a case that isn't even yours. I found something, Tessa said. Something that could help her. You found a theory, and you decided to bypass every protocol we have because you thought you were right. I am right. Carol's laugh was sharp. You don't get to be right. You're a floor nurse. You take orders. You don't give them. So I'm just supposed to ignore it? Yes. Carol leaned forward. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. This isn't some TV show where the underdog saves the day. This is a hospital. We have hierarchies for a reason. Wolf has been practicing medicine since before you were born. If he says the case is closed, it's closed. Tessa felt something crack open inside her chest. And if he's wrong? Then that's his problem, not yours. She was reassigned that afternoon, pulled from the East Wing and sent back to general rotation. No explanation, no appeal, just a schedule change and a warning to keep her head down. But 3 days later, everything changed. It was a Tuesday. Tessa was on a double shift, running on 4 hours of sleep and cold coffee when the alarm started. Not fire alarms, not code blue. Something else. Security alerts, lockdown protocols, the kind of thing that happened when someone important was coming through and they didn't want anyone in the way. Tessa was in a supply closet when she heard the boots. Not shoes. Boots. Heavy, synchronized, military. She stepped into the hallway and froze. 6 soldiers in full tactical gear were moving through the corridor like they owned it. Behind them, a man in a uniform so decorated it could have been a museum piece. 4 stars on his shoulders, a face carved from granite, eyes that looked like they'd seen things that would break most people. General Marcus Hale. He walked straight past Tessa without seeing her, went straight to the East Wing, straight to his daughter's room, and 30 seconds later the screaming started. Tessa ran. She wasn't supposed to. She wasn't cleared for that wing anymore. But she ran anyway, and when she got to the observation window, she saw Nora thrashing in the bed, hands clawing at her face, monitors shrieking, nurses frozen in the doorway like they didn't know whether to help or run. The general was inside trying to hold her down and failing. "Get Wolf!" someone shouted. "Get him now!" Tessa's hands moved without thinking. She grabbed a penlight from her pocket, pushed through the crowd, and stepped into the room. "Sir," she said, "let me try." The general's head snapped toward her. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm a nurse. I've been working with her." "She doesn't need a nurse. She needs a goddamn doctor." "I know." Tessa moved to the bedside slowly, hands visible. "Nora, it's Tessa. Can you hear me?" The girl's breathing was ragged, but she stopped thrashing. "Tessa?" "Yeah, I'm right here. I need you to listen to me, okay?" "Can you do that?" Nora nodded, barely. Tessa turned to the general. "When did this start?" 10 minutes ago. She woke up screaming, said it felt like something was pressing on her eyes. Tessa's stomach dropped. "Did anyone examine her?" "We're waiting for Wolf." "We don't have time." She pulled out the penlight, leaned in close, and gently lifted Nora's eyelid. And there it was. Not a shadow. Not artifact. Real. A thin, translucent membrane stretched across the surface of the optic nerve, so delicate it was almost invisible. But under the penlight, it caught the light, reflecting faintly like plastic wrap over glass. Tessa's hand trembled. "Sir," she said quietly, "I found something in her eyes." The general stared at her. "What?" "There's a membrane. It's blocking the optic nerve. That's why she's blind." The room went dead silent, and then the door slammed open, and Dr. Adrian Wolf walked in, flanked by 2 attendings and a lawyer. He saw Tessa standing there, penlight in hand, and his face went white. "Get her out of here," he said. "Now." But the general didn't move. He looked at Tessa, then at Wolf. "What did she just say?" The general asked, voice low and deadly calm. Wolf's jaw tightened. "She's not qualified to—" "I didn't ask if she was qualified. I asked what she said." Tessa met Wolf's eyes, and she didn't blink. "There's a removable membrane over her optic nerve," she said clearly. "It's been there since birth. And if you take it off, she'll be able to see. The general's face didn't move, but his voice dropped to something colder than Tessa had ever heard. "Dr. Wolf," he said, "is that true?" Wolf opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Tessa like she'd just set his career on fire. Which maybe she had. Wolf's mouth opened, but nothing came out. For 3 seconds that stretched like years, he just stood there. A man who'd spent decades building authority, suddenly realizing it could all collapse in the space of a single question. The general didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The silence in that room had weight, the kind that pressed down on your chest and made it hard to breathe. Tessa felt every eye on her. The nurses in the doorway, the attendings flanking Wolf, the soldiers standing just outside, hands resting on sidearms they probably weren't supposed to have inside a hospital. She was still holding the penlight, and her hand was shaking so badly she had to lower it before someone noticed. Wolf finally found his voice. "General Hale, I understand you're concerned, but this nurse has no authority to answer the question." Wolf's jaw worked. "The imaging is complex. There are artifacts, shadows that can appear to be... Is there a membrane on my daughter's optic nerve?" The lawyer next to Wolf stepped forward. "General, without a full examination, it would be irresponsible to... I'm not asking him to diagnose. I'm asking him to look." The general's voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. Right now, with his own eyes, not a scan, not a report, eyes. Wolf looked like a man being walked to the edge of a cliff. He glanced at Tessa, and for just a second she saw something flicker across his face. Not anger, fear. He moved to the bed, pulled out his own penlight, leaned in close to Nora, who'd gone completely still, her breath shallow and fast. Tessa watched his face, watched the exact moment he saw it. His hand froze. The penlight trembled. He pulled back, blinked, leaned in again like maybe he'd been wrong the first time. But he hadn't. "Well?" the general said. Wolf straightened slowly. His voice came out thin. "There's a density. Could it be removed?" "Theoretically, yes, but then remove it. General, we'd need to schedule surgery, run more tests, consult with... How long has it been there?" The question landed like a blade. Wolf went pale. "I can't say for certain without reviewing... You reviewed her when she was 5 years old. I have the records. You were the attending physician." The general's voice was a razor now, cutting through every excuse. "So I'll ask you again. How long has this been there?" Wolf's throat worked. The initial imaging was inconclusive. There were multiple interpretations, and the consensus at the time, how long? "Since birth," Wolf whispered. The room didn't explode. It imploded, like all the air got sucked out at once. The general stood there, absolutely motionless, staring at Wolf with an expression that could have leveled buildings. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet Tessa almost didn't hear it. "My daughter has been blind for 17 years because of a piece of tissue you could have removed when she was 5. It wasn't that simple. Get out." Wolf blinked. "General, get out of this room before I have you removed." One of the soldiers stepped forward. That was all it took. Wolf left, trailed by his attendings, and the lawyer, who was already on his phone, voice low and urgent. The door closed. The general stood there for a long moment, hands clenched at his sides, breathing hard. Then he turned to Tessa. "What's your name?" "Tessa Morgan." "How long have you worked here?" 8 months? He studied her. "And you saw this when no one else did?" It wasn't a question, but Tessa answered anyway. "I saw it on the imaging. I wasn't sure, so I checked the old files. There was a note from 12 years ago. Wolf had flagged it back then, but then he..." She trailed off. "He buried it." Tessa didn't reply. She didn't have to. The general looked at his daughter, who was sitting up now, hands twisting in the sheets. "Nora, you hear all that?" "Yes." "You scared?" "Yes." "Me too." He sat down on the edge of the bed, and for the first time since he'd walked into the hospital, he looked like a father instead of a commanding officer. "But we're going to fix this. You understand? We're going to make this right." Nora's voice was so small. "What if it doesn't work?" "Then we deal with that. But we try, okay?" She nodded. The general stood and turned back to Tessa. I want you on her care team. Tessa's heart kicked. Sir, I'm not qualified to... I don't care. You're the only person in this building who told me the truth. That makes you more qualified than anyone else here. He pulled out his phone, made a call, and said exactly 4 words. I need a team. 20 minutes later, the East Wing was swarming with people Tessa had never seen before. Specialists from Johns Hopkins. A neurosurgeon who'd been pulled off a flight in Atlanta and redirected midair. A federal medical liaison who showed up with a briefcase full of files and a look that said this was now officially a problem. Tessa was pulled into a conference room with 6 doctors, 2 lawyers, and a woman from the hospital's risk management department who looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. They fired questions at her for an hour. What exactly had she seen? When? Why hadn't she followed the chain of command? Did she understand the liability she'd created? Tessa answered every question the same way, clearly, calmly, without apology. When they finally let her go, her supervisor was waiting outside. You're suspended, Carol said flatly. Tessa blinked. What? Pending investigation. You violated protocols, accessed files without authorization, and made a diagnostic claim outside your scope of practice. You're lucky you're not fired. I saved her life. You don't know that yet. And even if you did, it doesn't matter. You broke the rules. The rules were protecting a mistake. Carol's face hardened. Go home, Tessa. Don't come back until you're cleared. Tessa walked out of Iron Vale that night feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under her. She'd expected pushback. She'd expected anger, but she hadn't expected to be punished for being right. She went home, sat on her couch, and stared at her phone. No messages, no calls, just silence. At 11 p.m., her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Miss Morgan. The voice was clipped, professional, military. This is Captain Reed with General Hale's office. The general wanted me to inform you that surgery is scheduled for tomorrow at 0600. He's requested your presence. Tessa's breath caught. I'm suspended. That's been handled. A car will pick you up at 0500. The line went dead. Tessa sat there for a long time, phone still pressed to her ear, trying to process what had just happened. Somewhere in the chain of command, someone had made a call. Someone with enough weight to override a hospital suspension like it was nothing. She didn't sleep, just sat at her kitchen table, drinking coffee and watching the clock. At 5 a.m., a black SUV pulled up outside her building. The driver didn't speak, just nodded when she climbed in. They drove through empty streets, the city still dark, and pulled up to a side entrance of Iron Vale she'd never used before. A soldier was waiting. He scanned her ID, handed her a visitor badge, and led her through a series of hallways that didn't appear on any map she'd seen. They ended up in a surgical wing that had been locked down. No staff, no visitors, just armed guards at every door. Inside the observation room, the general was standing with his arms crossed, staring through the glass at the operating theater below. He didn't turn when Tessa entered. She's been under for 20 minutes, he said. They're just starting. Tessa moved to the window. Below, Nora was on the table, surrounded by machines and monitors and a surgical team that moved with the kind of precision that came from doing this 1,000 times. The lead surgeon was someone Tessa recognized from journals, a woman named Dr. Ellison Cross, one of the best ophthalmic surgeons in the country. The procedure took 4 hours. Tessa watched every second. So did the general. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Either this worked or it didn't. At hour 3, one of the nurses in the theater looked up at the observation window and gave a thumbs up. Small, quick, barely visible. The general's shoulders dropped half an inch. At hour 4, Dr. Cross stepped back from the table, pulled off her gloves, and looked up at the window. She nodded once. The general closed his eyes. Tessa realized she was crying and didn't care. Nora woke up 2 hours later in recovery. Tessa wasn't there. She'd been pulled into another meeting, this one with hospital administration, the legal team, and a man in a suit who introduced himself as counsel for the Department of Defense. We need to understand the timeline, the man said. When you first noticed the abnormality, when you reported it, who you reported it to. Tessa walked them through it again. The scans, the notes, the conversation with Wolf. The email to patient advocacy. And Dr. Wolf's response? He told me to stay in my lane. One of the lawyers wrote that down. Did he review the imaging after you brought it to his attention? Not that I know of. Did he order any follow-up tests? No. More notes. The man in the suit leaned back. Miss Morgan, are you aware that this case is now under federal review? Tessa's stomach tightened. No. General Hale's daughter is a dependent of a high-ranking military officer. That makes this a matter of federal interest. Additionally, there are questions about whether Dr. Wolf knowingly withheld treatment, which could constitute medical fraud under the False Claims Act. Tessa's mouth went dry. I didn't know. You're not in trouble, the man said quickly. But we need your cooperation. There may be other cases, other patients who were misdiagnosed or had treatment delayed. We need to know if this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern. Tessa thought about the gaps in Nora's file. The missing referrals, the imaging reports that didn't line up. I think you should look at his other cases, she said quietly. The man nodded. We will. That night, Tessa went back to the recovery wing. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was still technically suspended, but no one stopped her. The guards knew who she was now. They stepped aside. Nora was sitting up in bed, bandages covering both eyes. The general was next to her, holding her hand. Hey, Tessa said softly. Nora's head turned. Tessa? Yeah. They said it worked. Tessa's throat tightened. They did? They won't know for sure until they take the bandages off, but Dr. Cross said the membrane came off clean. No damage to the nerve. Nora's voice cracked. She said, I might actually see. Tessa sat down in the chair on the other side of the bed. You're going to see. You don't know that. Yeah, I do. The general looked at her, and for the first time something in his face softened. Thank you, he said. Tessa shook her head. I just did my job. No, you did more than that. He stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the city lights. I've been in the military for 30 years. I've seen people follow orders that made no sense. I've seen people stay silent because speaking up was dangerous. And I've seen what happens when good people decide the rules matter more than doing what's right. He turned back to her. You could have walked away. No one would have blamed you. Yes, they would have, Tessa said. I would have. The general smiled, just barely. You're going to have a hell of a fight ahead of you. You know that, right? I figured. Wolf's not going down quietly. Neither is the hospital. They're going to come at you with everything they have. Lawyers, investigators. They'll try to discredit you, make you look reckless, paint this as a lucky guess. Tessa met his eyes. Let them try. The next morning, the hospital's board of directors called an emergency meeting. Tessa wasn't invited, but she heard about it anyway. Wolf had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. 3 other doctors in his department had been flagged for review. The hospital's legal team was in full damage control mode, trying to figure out how to spin this before it became a media firestorm. They were too late. By noon, the story had leaked. Not the details, not yet, but enough. Military general's daughter undergoes emergency surgery after years of alleged misdiagnosis. The hospital's phones started ringing. News vans pulled up outside. Reporters camped out in the lobby, shoving microphones at anyone in scrubs. Tessa stayed away. She went home, locked her door, and ignored the knocks that started around 3 p.m. Reporters. Producers. Someone claiming to be from a podcast. She didn't answer. That night her phone rang. Not a reporter, the hospital's chief of staff. Miss Morgan, I'd like to meet with you. Tessa's grip tightened on the phone. Why? Because we need to talk about your future here. I'm suspended. That's been lifted, effective immediately. In fact, I'd like to discuss a position on our patient safety committee. We're restructuring our protocols, and your perspective would be valuable. Tessa laughed, sharp and bitter. You want to put me on a committee? It's an important role. You want to bury me. Her voice was flat now. Give me a title. Stick me in meetings. Make sure I'm too busy to talk to anyone who matters. The chief was quiet for a beat. Miss Morgan, I'm offering you an opportunity. No, you're offering me a muzzle. Tessa stood, pacing her tiny living room. I don't want a committee. I want you to fix the system that let this happen. We are fixing it by promoting the person who broke the rules? That's not a fix, that's a PR move. The chief's tone cooled. I'd advise you to think carefully before turning this down. I don't need to think. The answer's no. She hung up. 2 days later, the bandages came off. Tessa was there. So was the general. So was a room full of doctors, nurses, and one very nervous hospital administrator who kept glancing at the door like he wanted to run. Dr. Cross worked slowly, peeling back layer after layer of gauze, while Nora sat perfectly still, hands gripping the armrests of her chair. Okay, Dr. Cross said gently. I'm going to remove the last layer. Keep your eyes closed until I say. Nora nodded. The final bandage came away. Dr. Cross stepped back. Now, she said, open your eyes. Nora's eyelids fluttered, opened, and then she screamed. Not in pain, in shock. Her hands flew to her face, and she gasped like she'd just surfaced from drowning. I can see, she choked out. Oh my God, I can see. The general's face crumpled. He moved to her, pulled her into his arms, and Tessa saw his shoulders shake. Dr. Cross was smiling, and half the staff were wiping their eyes. And for one perfect moment, everything else fell away. The politics, the lawsuits, the fear. This was why Tessa had become a nurse. Not for the moments when everything went smooth, for the ones like this, the impossible ones. Nora pulled back from her father, blinking hard, and her gaze swept the room. She looked at the doctors, the machines, the walls, and then she looked at Tessa. Their eyes met, and Nora's face broke into a smile so bright it could have lit the whole city. I see you, she whispered. Tessa nodded, couldn't speak, just nodded. But the moment didn't last. That afternoon, Tessa was served with papers. A formal complaint filed by Dr. Adrian Wolf, alleging defamation, interference with patient care, and professional misconduct. He was suing her personally for damages in excess of $2 million. The hospital's legal team sent a message an hour later. They would not be providing her with counsel. She was on her own. Tessa sat in her apartment, staring at the lawsuit, feeling the walls close in. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number again. She answered, Miss Morgan, this is Daniel Cross. I'm an attorney with the Public Accountability Project. We represent whistleblowers in medical negligence cases. Tessa's heart was pounding. How did you get my number? General Hale gave it to me. He thought you might need help. I don't have money for a lawyer. We work pro bono. And Miss Morgan, I'm not calling to defend you against Wolf's lawsuit. I'm calling because we've been investigating Iron Vale Medical Center for 3 years, and we think you just broke the case wide open. Tessa's breath caught. What are you talking about? Dr. Wolf isn't the only one. We've identified at least 12 other cases over the past decade where patients were misdiagnosed, had treatment delayed, or were steered toward more expensive procedures when simpler ones would have worked. We think it's institutional, and we think you have the evidence to prove it. Tessa's hands were shaking. What do you need from me? Everything. Files, emails, notes, anything you've got. And I need you to be ready, because when this goes public, it's going to get ugly. It's already ugly. Cross laughed, low and humorless. Miss Morgan, you haven't seen ugly yet. He was right. The next week, the federal investigation went public. Not just into Wolf, but into the entire ophthalmology department. Subpoenas were issued. Files were seized. 2 more doctors were placed on leave. And then the patients started coming forward. A man who'd been told his cataracts were inoperable, only to find out they could have been removed 5 years ago. A woman whose daughter had been declared legally blind when the condition was reversible with a routine surgery. A teenager who'd lost vision in one eye because a treatable infection had been ignored. 12 cases became 20, then 30, then 50. The media descended like locusts. Iron Vale's reputation, built over decades, collapsed in a matter of days. The CEO resigned. 3 board members followed. The hospital's stock, publicly traded, tied to a larger healthcare conglomerate, plummeted. And through it all, Tessa's name kept coming up. The nurse who'd blown the whistle, the outsider who'd taken on the system. She became a target. Online, anonymous accounts started posting her address, her phone number, her nursing school transcripts. Someone dug up a photo from a college party where she'd been drunk and posted it with the caption, "This is your hero?" A fake Twitter account claiming to be her said horrible things, and by the time it was taken down, the screenshots had spread everywhere. She stopped going outside, stopped answering her phone, lived on delivery food and coffee because leaving her apartment felt like walking into a firing squad. Her supervisor called. "Tessa, I need you to come in." "I can't." "You have to. They're talking about terminating you for cause." Tessa closed her eyes. "Let them." "You're not hearing me. If they fire you for cause, you lose your license. You'll never work as a nurse again." The words hit like a punch. "When?" Tessa asked. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., disciplinary hearing. If you don't show, they'll rule in absentia." Tessa hung up and sat in the dark, staring at nothing. At 9:45 the next morning, she walked into Ironvale Medical Center for what might be the last time. She wore her scrubs because if they were going to take her license, they were going to do it while she was dressed like the nurse she'd worked so hard to become. The hearing room was packed. Hospital administrators, union reps, lawyers, and at the far end of the table, Dr. Adrian Wolf, looking calm and composed, like this was just another day. The chair of the disciplinary board called the meeting to order. "Miss Morgan, you've been accused of gross insubordination, unauthorized access to patient files, and practicing outside your scope. How do you plead?" Tessa looked at Wolf, then at the board. "Guilty," she said. The room stirred. "I accessed files I wasn't supposed to. I made a diagnostic observation I wasn't qualified to make. I went over my supervisor's head. I broke the rules." The board members exchanged glances. The chair leaned forward. "Then you understand that we have grounds for termination?" "Yes." "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Tessa took a breath. "Just one thing." She pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. "What is this?" the chair asked. "Every case I could find where a patient under Dr. Wolf's care had a delayed diagnosis, a mistreatment, or a procedure that was more expensive than necessary. 53 cases, all documented, all cross-referenced with billing records." The chair opened the folder. His face went pale. Tessa kept going. "You want to fire me for breaking the rules? Fine. But those rules protected this. They protected a system where doctors could bury mistakes, where patients could suffer for years, and where people like me were supposed to stay quiet and let it happen." Her voice didn't shake. "So yeah, I broke the rules, and I do it again." The room was dead silent. Wolf stood, his face red. "This is slander. I'll sue you for every—" The door opened. 2 federal agents walked in, followed by Daniel Cross and a woman in a sharp suit who introduced herself as a prosecutor with the U.S. Attorney's Office. "Dr. Adrian Wolf," the woman said, "you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, falsification of medical records, and obstruction of justice." Wolf's face went white. "You can't." "We can. We have warrants for your records, your communications, and your financial accounts. You have the right to remain silent." They cuffed him, right there, in front of everyone. As they let him out, he looked back at Tessa, and the expression on his face was pure hatred. The door closed. The room erupted into chaos, and Tessa just stood there, hands shaking, wondering if she'd just won or lost everything. The board chair cleared his throat. "Miss Morgan, this hearing is postponed, pending further review." Tessa walked out of that room and didn't stop until she was outside, standing in the cold air, breathing hard. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Good work. Now it gets worse." Tessa stared at the message until her screen went dark. She didn't recognize the number, didn't know if it was a threat or a warning or just some journalist fishing for a reaction. She deleted it and shoved the phone in her pocket, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. A camera crew was setting up across the street. She turned and went back inside, took the service elevator down to the parking garage, and left through a side exit that dumped her into an alley 2 blocks from the main entrance. She walked fast, head down, hands jammed in her pockets, and didn't stop until she was on a bus heading east into a part of the city she'd never been to. She got off at a random stop, went into a coffee shop, and sat in the back corner with her phone face down on the table. The barista kept glancing at her like she was trying to place the face, and Tessa realized with a sick jolt that she'd been on the news. Not just mentioned, shown. Someone had pulled a photo from her nursing school graduation and plastered it across every screen in the region. She pulled her hood up and tried to disappear into the cracked vinyl booth. Her phone buzzed. Not a text this time. A call. Daniel Cross. She answered. Yeah. Where are you? His voice was sharp. Does it matter? Yes, we need to meet now. I'm not going back to the hospital. I'm not asking you to. There's a diner on Ashford and 9th. Be there in 20 minutes. He hung up before she could argue. Tessa sat there for a long moment, staring at her cold coffee. Every instinct told her to run, get on another bus, get out of Raven City entirely. But running wouldn't stop what was coming. It would just delay it. She paid and left. The diner was one of those old-school places with cracked linoleum and booths held together with duct tape. Cross was already there, sitting in the back with a briefcase open on the table and a look on his face that said he hadn't slept in days. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of sharp, exhausted energy that came from working cases no one else wanted. Tessa slid into the booth. What's going on? Cross didn't waste time. They're coming after you. I figured. No, you don't get it. Not just Wolf. The hospital. The entire healthcare conglomerate that owns Iron Vale. They're building a case that you're a disgruntled employee with a history of insubordination who fabricated evidence to destroy a respected physician. Tessa's stomach dropped. That's insane. That's their strategy, and it's working. He pulled out a tablet, turned it toward her. Headlines. Nurse or saboteur? Questions emerge about Tessa Morgan's motives. Former colleagues describe Morgan as difficult and attention-seeking. Iron Vale Medical Center claims wrongful allegations damage patient trust. Tessa felt bile rise in her throat. Who are these colleagues? Does it matter? They're anonymous, but the quotes are everywhere. Someone's feeding the media a narrative and they're eating it up. What about the patients, the 53 cases? Under review, but here's the problem. Most of those cases are years old. Statutes of limitations, expired malpractice windows. And the ones that aren't? The hospital's lawyers are claiming they were judgment calls, not negligence. They're saying Wolf made reasonable decisions based on the information available at the time. That's bullshit. Maybe, but it's defensible bullshit. Cross leaned back, rubbed his face. The arrest was federal, fraud charges. But that case is going to take months, maybe years. In the meantime, you're the face of this, and they're going to rip you apart. Tessa's voice came out flat. So what do I do? You fight back. We go public. Not just with the cases, but with everything. The culture at Iron Vale, the pressure to keep quiet, the retaliation you faced. We make you the hero, not the villain. I'm not a hero. You're what we've got. Cross's eyes were hard. Listen to me. This isn't just about Wolf. This is about a system that protects itself by destroying people who speak up. If we lose this, it sends a message to every nurse, every tech, every low-level staffer in every hospital in the country. Keep your mouth shut, or we'll bury you. Tessa looked at the headlines again. At her own face, grainy and unflattering, staring back at her. When do we start? She asked. Cross smiled, thin and sharp. We already did. The interview aired 3 days later, national news, prime time. Tessa sat across from a journalist who'd built a career on exposing corruption, and for 20 minutes she told the whole story. The scans, the notes, Wolf's dismissal, the retaliation, the patients who'd suffered because someone had decided the truth was too expensive. She didn't cry, didn't perform, just spoke clearly and looked straight into the camera. The backlash was immediate. Online, the hospital's defenders came out in force. She was a liar, a fame seeker, a bitter employee with an axe to grind. Someone posted her student loan balance and claimed she was doing this for money. Another account dug up a bad performance review from her second month at Iron Vale, real or fake, Tessa couldn't tell, and used it as proof she was incompetent. But something else happened too. Other nurses started talking, not publicly at first. Anonymous posts on forums, Reddit threads, private messages to journalists, stories about being ignored, overruled, punished for questioning doctors, about cultures where hierarchy mattered more than patients. Within a week, it wasn't just Tessa's story anymore. It was everywhere. The hospital tried to contain it, issued statements, hired a crisis PR firm. The CEO appeared on camera looking somber and concerned, promising a full internal review and new protocols to ensure patient safety. But then the billing records leaked. Someone inside Ironvale, Tessa never found out who, sent a trove of documents to a journalist at the Raven City Tribune. Spreadsheets showing procedures that had been coded as more complex than they actually were. Bills for surgeries that had been delayed, rescheduled, split into multiple visits to maximize reimbursement, and in the middle of it all, Wolf's name, over and over, tied to cases where the simplest solution had been bypassed in favor of the most expensive. The Tribune ran it as a 6-part series. The Price of Silence, How One Hospital Chose Profit Over Patients. The governor called for an investigation. Federal regulators opened a review. And the lawsuit started. Not just from the patients Tessa had identified, but from dozens more who came forward. People who'd been treated at Ironvale over the past decade and were now wondering if they'd been lied to. The hospital's lawyers went to war. They filed motions to dismiss, demanded gag orders, argued that the leaked billing records were inadmissible, and they went after Tessa with everything they had. Her nursing license was suspended pending a state board review. The allegation, practicing outside her scope, unauthorized access to patient records, and conduct unbecoming of a healthcare professional. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, and if the board ruled against her, she'd never work as a nurse again. Cross filed a countersuit on her behalf. Wrongful termination, retaliation, whistleblower protections. But that case would take years, and in the meantime, Tessa had no job, no income, and a legal defense that was eating through what little savings she had. She moved out of her apartment, couldn't afford it anymore, and crashed on the couch of a friend from nursing school who lived in a neighborhood where the rent was cheap and the buses ran late. She picked up shifts at a walk-in clinic under the table, cash only, doing vaccinations and strep tests for people who couldn't afford real health care. It wasn't nursing, it was survival. And then Nora called. Tessa almost didn't answer. She'd avoided talking to the Hales since the arrest, partly because she didn't know what to say, partly because she didn't want to drag them deeper into the mess. But Nora's name kept flashing on the screen, and finally Tessa picked up. "Hey, I'm testifying." Nora's voice was steady, but Tessa could hear the tremor underneath. "At Wolf's trial. The prosecutor asked me to, and I said yes." Tessa's throat tightened. "Nora, you don't have to." "Yeah, I do. You risked everything for me. I'm not going to sit back and let them destroy you." "They're going to tear you apart on the stand." "Let them try." Nora paused. "I can see now, Tessa. I can see my dad's face. I can see trees and buildings and stupid stuff like traffic lights. I can see because you didn't stay quiet, so I'm not staying quiet either." Tessa closed her eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet, just be ready. This is going to get worse before it gets better." She was right. The prosecution's case was solid. Financial records showing Wolf had billed for procedures he'd recommended against simpler, cheaper alternatives. Expert testimony confirming that the membrane on Nora's optic nerve could have been identified and removed years earlier. Patient after patient taking the stand to describe being told their conditions were untreatable, only to find out later that they weren't. But Wolf's defense was better. His lawyer was a man named Victor Trent, a former prosecutor with a reputation for scorched earth tactics. He tore into every witness, questioned their memories, pointed out inconsistencies in medical records that were a decade old, suggested that patients were misremembering or that their current doctors were biased, or that hindsight was warping their perception of what had actually happened. And when Nora took the stand, Trent went for the throat. "Miss Hale, you were blind your entire life, is that correct?" "Yes." "And now you can see?" "Yes." "That must be overwhelming." Nora's jaw tightened. "It's incredible." "I'm sure it is. But let me ask you something. You've spent 17 years in darkness. You've never seen a courtroom, never seen a jury, never seen my face or the judge's face or your father's face. And now, after just a few weeks of vision, you're here telling us that Dr. Wolf deliberately withheld treatment from you. Is that right?" "He did." "How do you know?" "Because the doctors told me." "The doctors told you, but you didn't see the scans yourself. You didn't review the medical literature. You didn't consult with other specialists. You're testifying based on what other people have told you, aren't you?" Nora's face flushed. I'm testifying based on the fact that I was blind for 17 years because someone didn't do their job, or because your condition was complex and difficult to diagnose, and Dr. Wolf made the best decision he could with the information he had. That's not what happened, isn't it? Trent turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this young woman has been through a traumatic experience. She's been told that her blindness was preventable, that someone failed her, and I don't doubt that she believes that. But belief isn't evidence. The prosecutor objected. The judge sustained it. But the damage was done. Tessa watched from the gallery, hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood. When the prosecution called her to the stand, she knew what was coming. Trent started slow, walked her through her background, her education, her employment history. You were at Iron Vale for 8 months before this incident, correct? Yes. And in that time, how many formal commendations did you receive? Tessa's stomach sank. None. How many times were you written up for performance issues? Twice. What for? Being late to a shift and not following a medication protocol correctly. So you have a history of not following protocols. That's not yes or no, Miss Morgan. Do you have a history of not following protocols? Tessa's jaw tightened. Yes. Trent paced in front of the jury. You accessed Nora Hale's medical files without authorization, didn't you? I had access as part of her care team. But you reviewed records that predated your assignment to her case. Records from when she was 5 years old. Records that had nothing to do with your duties as a floor nurse. I was trying to help her. Or you were looking for something to justify a vendetta against Dr. Wolf. That's insane. Is it? You filed a complaint against him before you ever spoke to him directly about the case. You went over his head, bypassed the chain of command, and when he confronted you, you doubled down. Isn't that right? Tessa's hands were shaking. He dismissed me. He wouldn't listen. Because you're not a doctor, you're a nurse. And in a hospital, there's a hierarchy for a reason. Patients' lives depend on people knowing their roles. Patients' lives depend on people telling the truth. Trent smiled, cold and sharp. And you believe you're the only one telling the truth here? I believe I saw something that everyone else missed, or that everyone else evaluated and correctly dismissed as clinically insignificant, and you, desperate for recognition, for validation, decided you knew better. The prosecutor objected. The judge warned Trent. But Tessa could see the jury's faces. Some of them looked skeptical now, uncertain. When she stepped down, she felt like she'd been stripped to the bone. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they came back, the courtroom was packed. Media, patients, hospital staff who'd taken sides. Tessa sat in the back row next to Cross, trying not to throw up. The foreman stood. On the count of healthcare fraud, we find the defendant guilty. The room erupted. Wolf's face went white. His lawyer started shouting objections. The judge banged her gavel. On the count of falsification of medical records, we find the defendant guilty. Tessa's hands were shaking so hard she had to grip the bench in front of her. On the count of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty. The judge called for order, but it was chaos. Reporters were sprinting for the doors. Cameras were flashing. Somewhere behind her, Tessa heard someone sobbing. Wolf was led out in cuffs. He didn't look at her, didn't look at anyone. Cross leaned over. You did it. Tessa shook her head. It's not over. She was right. The hospital's board of directors called an emergency meeting that night. By morning, 3 executives had resigned. By the end of the week, the hospital announced it was filing for bankruptcy protection, citing unprecedented legal liabilities and reputational damage, which meant the patient suing for malpractice would get pennies on the dollar. Maybe nothing at all. The nursing board hearing was 2 days later. Tessa walked into a conference room with fluorescent lights and cheap carpet, sat across from a panel of 5 nurses who'd never met her, and listened as the hospital's lawyer laid out the case for why her license should be revoked. Unauthorized access, insubordination, practicing outside her scope, conduct unbecoming. Her own lawyer, a public defender who looked about 12 and had approximately 15 minutes to prep, tried to argue that she'd acted in the patient's best interest, that whistleblower protection should apply. The panel listened, asked questions, took notes. At the end, the chair looked at Tessa. Do you have anything to say? Tessa stood. Her voice was steady. I broke the rules. I knew I was breaking them when I did it. But I also knew that if I didn't, a 17-year-old girl was going to spend the rest of her life blind because someone decided their career was more important than her eyes. One of the panel members frowned. You're not a doctor. You didn't have the training to make that determination. You're right, I didn't, but I had eyes, and I had a brain, and I had access to case studies that showed I wasn't crazy. Tessa's hands were shaking again, but she didn't hide it. I'm not asking you to say I was right to break the rules. I'm asking you to consider what would have happened if I hadn't. The panel deliberated for an hour. When they came back, the chair's face was unreadable. Miss Morgan, this board recognizes the complexity of the situation you faced. We also recognize that the patient in question did, in fact, benefit from your intervention. However, we cannot ignore the serious breaches of protocol that occurred. Tessa's stomach dropped. Therefore, we are issuing a formal reprimand which will remain on your record for 5 years. Your license will be suspended for 6 months. After that period, you may reapply for reinstatement, subject to completion of additional ethics training. Tessa blinked. That's it? The chair's expression softened just barely. That's it. Tessa walked out of that room and made it halfway down the hallway before her legs gave out. She sat on the floor, back against the wall, and finally let herself cry. Cross found her there 10 minutes later. He didn't say anything, just sat down next to her and handed her a tissue. 6 months, Tessa said. Could have been worse. Could have been better. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. You know what happens now, right? Tessa wiped her eyes. What? The hospital's bankrupt. Wolf's going to prison. But the conglomerate that owned Ironvale, they're still out there. 12 other hospitals in 4 states. And if we don't go after them, they're just going to keep doing this. Tessa looked at him. We? I'm building a class action. Patients from all 12 hospitals. Hundreds of cases, maybe thousands. And I need someone who knows how the system works from the inside. I can't work for 6 months. I'm not asking you to work as a nurse. I'm asking you to consult. Help us identify patterns. Review records. Testify if it goes to trial. Tessa laughed, bitter and exhausted. You want me to do this again? I want you to finish what you started. She didn't answer. Just sat there, staring at the scuffed linoleum, trying to figure out if she had anything left to give. Her phone buzzed. A text from Nora. Dad wants to talk to you, says it's important. Tessa met the general at a park on the edge of the city. It was late afternoon, cold enough that her breath misted in the air. He was sitting on a bench in civilian clothes, looking older than he had in the hospital, less like a commanding officer and more like a father who'd been through hell. Sit, he said. She sat. He didn't speak for a long moment, just stared out at the empty playground, the rusted swings moving slightly in the wind. They're offering me a position, he said finally. Inspector General's office. Oversight for military medical facilities. They want someone who will actually hold people accountable. Tessa nodded. That's good. It's a nightmare. Politics, bureaucracy. But it's also a chance to make sure what happened to Nora doesn't happen to some other kid at some other hospital. You should take it. I am. He turned to look at her. And I want you to come with me. Tessa blinked. What? Consultant. You'd review cases, help identify systemic failures, train staff on how to escalate concerns without getting crushed. It's a federal position, good pay, better benefits, and you'd be protected. I don't have a license. You will in 6 months. Until then, you don't need one for this. You're not treating patients. You're fixing systems. Tessa stared at him. Why me? Because you didn't back down. Because you saw something wrong and you didn't wait for permission to fix it. That's rare. And it's exactly what I need. She shook her head. I'm not a hero, General. I'm just someone who got lucky. Luck had nothing to do with it. His voice was firm. You made a choice, and that choice saved my daughter's life. So yeah, I want you on my team. Tessa looked out at the playground, at the empty swings, at the city stretching out beyond the trees. She thought about the past 3 months, the lawsuits, the threats. The night she'd spent wondering if speaking up had been the stupidest thing she'd ever done. But she also thought about Nora, about the moment the bandages came off, and she'd seen the world for the first time. "Okay," Tessa said quietly. "I'll do it." The general smiled. "Good. You start in 2 weeks." That night, Tessa went back to her friend's apartment, packed her things, and tried to imagine what came next. She'd spent so long fighting just to survive that the idea of actually building something felt almost impossible. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Again. She almost didn't answer. But something made her pick up. A voice she didn't recognize. Male. Calm. Professional. "Miss Morgan, my name is Dr. Ellison Cross. We met briefly at Ironvale." Tessa's breath caught. The surgeon who'd operated on Nora. "I remember. I'm calling because I've been asked to lead a task force on medical accountability and patient advocacy. It's a multi-state initiative, funded by a coalition of hospitals that want to rebuild public trust. We're looking for people who understand what went wrong at Ironvale, people who aren't afraid to tell the truth." Tessa's heart was pounding. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'd be willing to help us make sure this never happens again." Tessa closed her eyes, thought about the 53 cases, the patients who'd come forward, the ones who hadn't. "What do you need?" she asked. "Everything you've got, and a commitment to see this through, no matter how ugly it gets." "It's already ugly." Dr. Cross laughed, soft and sad. "Miss Morgan, we haven't even started." The call ended. Tessa sat there in the dark, staring at her phone. 2 offers, 2 chances to keep fighting. She should have felt relieved, hopeful, but all she felt was exhausted. Her phone buzzed again. A news alert. "Breaking, federal investigation expands to 12 hospitals and healthcare conglomerate scandal." And below it, another headline. "Whistleblower nurse Tessa Morgan named in $400 million defamation lawsuit by former Ironvale executives." Tessa's hands went numb. She clicked the article, read the details. The executives, 3 of them, including the former CEO, were suing her personally, claiming she'd knowingly made false statements that destroyed their careers and the hospital's reputation. The lawsuit demanded damages, a public apology, and a permanent gag order preventing her from ever speaking about Ironvale again. Tessa's phone slipped from her hands and hit the floor, because she'd just realized something. Wolf going to prison wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And the people who'd built the system he'd exploited weren't going to let her tear it down without a fight. Her phone rang again. She didn't pick it up, just stared at it, watching it buzz and light up and buzz again. Outside, somewhere in the city, a siren wailed, and Tessa sat alone in the dark, wondering if she'd just won the battle only to lose the war. Tessa picked up the phone on the 6th ring. Daniel Cross didn't wait for her to speak. "You saw it." "Yeah." $400 million. They're not playing around." Tessa's voice came out flat. "What do I do?" "You show up. We fight it, and we make them regret ever filing." "With what?" "I'm broke, Daniel. I've got $600 in my account and a couch that isn't even mine. You've got something better. You've got the truth, and you've got me." He paused. "Emergency meeting, tomorrow morning. My office. Don't talk to anyone until then." The line went dead. Tessa sat there, phone still pressed to her ear, feeling the walls close in. $400 million. The number was so absurd it didn't even feel real. But the lawsuit was real. The executives were real. And the message was clear. If you come after us, we'll destroy you so completely there won't be anything left to bury. She didn't sleep that night, just lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, replaying every decision she'd made since the day she'd first seen Nora's scans. Every choice that had seemed so obvious in the moment now felt reckless, stupid, suicidal. By the time dawn broke, she'd convinced herself she was finished. Cross's office was in a building that looked like it should have been condemned 20 years ago. Peeling paint, flickering lights, an elevator that shuddered and groaned like it was deciding whether to move or just give up. Tessa took the stairs. The office itself was barely better, stacks of files everywhere, a desk buried under paper, coffee cups in various states of abandonment. Cross was at his computer, tie loosened, eyes bloodshot, looking like he'd been there all night. He glanced up when she walked in. "Sit." She sat. He spun his monitor around. On the screen was the lawsuit, all 93 pages of it. Claims of defamation, tortious interference, intentional infliction of emotional distress, demands for damages, injunctions, public retractions. They filed this in state court, Cross said. That's tactical. Federal court would have meant judges who deal with whistleblower cases all the time. State court? They're gambling on a jury that doesn't understand the law and just sees a young nurse who destroyed people's careers. Can they win? They can try. But here's the thing. They made a mistake. He pulled up another document. They're claiming you knowingly made false statements. That means they have to prove you knew the information was false when you said it. And they can't. How do you know? Because every statement you made was either backed by medical records or expert testimony. They can argue you were wrong. They can argue you misinterpreted, but they can't prove you lied. He leaned back, which means this isn't about winning. It's about bleeding you dry. They want you to spend every dollar you have on legal fees, every hour in depositions, every night terrified that you're going to lose everything. They want to make an example out of you. Tessa's hands were shaking again. So what do we do? We counterpunch. Hard. Cross pulled up a new file. I've been going through the hospital's internal communications, emails, memos, meeting minutes, and I found something interesting. He turned the screen back toward her. It was an email chain from 3 years ago. Subject line, Revenue Optimization Strategy. Tessa scanned it. Her stomach turned. The executives who were now suing her had written these emails, discussing ways to increase billing revenue, suggesting that certain procedures be unbundled, split into multiple steps to maximize reimbursement, recommending that physicians be incentivized to choose more complex treatments over simpler ones. And in the middle of it all, a line that made Tessa's blood run cold. Patient outcomes are secondary to financial sustainability. They put it in writing, she whispered. They put it in writing. Cross's smile was sharp. And they're about to find out what happens when you sue someone who has receipts. The countersuit was filed 2 days later, not just against the executives, but against the entire healthcare conglomerate. Fraud, racketeering, systematic patient exploitation. Cross went for the throat, and he didn't stop. The media picked it up immediately. Whistleblower nurse fights back against $400 million lawsuit. Internal emails reveal hospital executives prioritized profit over patients. Tessa Morgan, from scapegoat to champion? The executives tried to bury it, issued statements calling the emails taken out of context, hired a PR firm to flood the media with stories about the good work the conglomerate had done, the lives they'd saved, the communities they'd served. But the patients kept coming forward. A woman in Ohio whose knee surgery had been delayed for 6 months, split into 3 separate procedures, each billed at full price. A man in Pennsylvania who'd been told he needed spinal fusion when physical therapy would have worked. A child in Michigan who'd undergone unnecessary testing because it was more profitable than a simple diagnosis. Hundreds of them. Then thousands. The conglomerate's stock price collapsed. Board members started resigning. And the executives who'd sued Tessa found themselves facing criminal investigations in 3 states. But none of that stopped the lawsuit. The first deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a conference room that smelled like old carpet and burnt coffee. Tessa sat across from 3 lawyers representing the executives, with Cross next to her and a court reporter in the corner typing every word. The lead attorney was a woman named Patricia Vance, mid-50s, expensive suit, the kind of polished ruthlessness that came from decades of winning cases other people thought were unwinnable. She started slow, background questions. Education. Employment history. How Tessa had ended up at Ironvale. Then she shifted. You've stated publicly that you reviewed Nora Hale's medical files and identified a treatable condition that had been missed. Is that correct? Yes. And you're not a physician? No. You're not a radiologist? No. You're not an ophthalmologist? No. Vance leaned forward. So on what basis did you conclude that multiple board-certified doctors, including my clients, had missed something that you, a nurse with less than a year of experience, had found? Tessa kept her voice steady. I read the case studies. I looked at the scans. I saw the membrane. You saw what you thought was a membrane, but you didn't have the training to make that determination, did you? I had enough training to know it was worth investigating. Or you had enough ambition to know that making a dramatic accusation would get you attention. Cross cut in. Objection, argumentative. Vance smiled. Let me rephrase. Miss Morgan, did you consider the possibility that you were wrong? Yes. And yet you proceeded anyway. You filed complaints. You contacted the media. You testified in a criminal trial, all without any formal qualification to diagnose the condition you claim to have found. I wasn't diagnosing. I was reporting what I saw, what you thought you saw. And when Dr. Wolf told you that your interpretation was incorrect, you didn't accept his professional judgment. You escalated. You went over his head. You made his life a living hell until he was arrested and convicted. Isn't that what really happened? Tessa's jaw tightened. No. No. Then tell me, Miss Morgan, what would you call it when a subordinate deliberately undermines a superior, accuses them of malpractice, and destroys their career based on nothing more than a hunch? I'd call it saving a girl's eyesight. Vance's expression didn't change. You'd call it heroism. The rest of us call it insubordination. The deposition lasted 6 hours. By the end, Tessa felt like she'd been through an interrogation. Every answer picked apart, every word twisted. Vance was good, and she knew exactly what she was doing, building a narrative where Tessa was a reckless, glory-seeking troublemaker who'd destroyed lives for attention. When it was over, Cross walked her out to the parking garage. You did fine, he said. I sounded like an idiot. You sounded human. That's better. He stopped next to his car. Listen to me. They're going to keep hammering you. Depositions, interrogatories, requests for documents. They're going to make this as painful as possible. But every hour they spend on this is an hour they're not spending defending themselves against the criminal charges. So you hang in there and you let them waste their time. Tessa nodded, but she felt hollowed out. That night, she got another call. General Hale. I heard about the deposition, he said. News travels fast. Tessa, I need you to know something. If you want to walk away from this, no one would blame you. You've done more than anyone had a right to ask. I can't walk away. Why not? She didn't answer right away. Just stared out the window at the city lights. Because if I do, they win. And the next person who sees something wrong will look at what happened to me and decide it's not worth it. The general was quiet for a moment. You sound like a soldier. I sound like someone who's too stubborn to quit. He laughed, low and rough. That works too. The trial for the defamation lawsuit was set for 8 months out. In the meantime, the federal investigation into the healthcare conglomerate accelerated. Subpoenas went out. Financial records were seized. Executives were called to testify before a grand jury. And slowly, piece by piece, the full scope of what had been happening came into focus. It wasn't just Iron Veil. It was systemic. 12 hospitals across 4 states, all operating under the same directives. Maximize revenue, minimize liability, prioritize profitability over patient care. Billing fraud, unnecessary procedures, delayed treatments, and at the top, a network of executives who'd built their careers on a model that treated patients like revenue streams. The indictments came down in waves. First the CFO, then the regional medical director, then the CEO himself, a man named Gerald Roth, who'd been profiled in business magazines as a visionary leader in healthcare innovation. He was arrested at his home in Virginia at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. The footage made national news. Him in handcuffs being led out of a mansion that looked like something from a magazine, while his lawyers shouted about wrongful prosecution and procedural violations. Tessa watched it on her phone, sitting in a coffee shop, and felt nothing. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just exhaustion. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. You did this. She stared at it, didn't respond, deleted it. Another text came through, same number. I hope it was worth it. Her hands were shaking. She blocked the number and put her phone face down on the table. But the messages kept coming, different numbers, same tone. Some were threats, some were just cruel. Someone posted her current address online and she had to move again. This time to a motel on the edge of the city where the manager didn't ask questions and the locks were better than the furniture. Cross tried to get a restraining order. The judge denied it. Insufficient evidence. No credible threat. They're trying to break you, Cross said. Don't let them. I'm already broken. No, you're tired. There's a difference. Tessa wanted to believe him. But every morning felt like walking through mud. Every conversation felt like a performance. She was running on fumes and spite, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep it up. And then the defense made a mistake. In their response to Cross's countersuit, they included a set of internal memos that were supposed to support their case. Documents showing that the executives had acted in good conscience, that the revenue strategies had been approved by legal counsel, that everything they'd done was within the bounds of accepted practice. Cross read through them, then read them again. Then called Tessa at 2 a.m., voice buzzing with something she hadn't heard from him before. Excitement. They screwed up. Tessa sat up, groggy. What? The memos. They're redacted, but they did a sloppy job. I can see metadata, dates, timestamps, and they don't match the narrative. What does that mean? It means they altered the documents. And if they altered these, they might have altered others. He paused. I need you to meet me at the office. Now. Tessa was there in 20 minutes. Cross had 3 laptops open, screens filled with documents, spreadsheets, metadata analysis. He looked like a man possessed. Look at this. He pointed to a memo dated March 2019. This is supposed to be from a board meeting where they discussed patient care protocols. But the metadata shows it was created in November 2023, 2 months after Wolf was arrested. Tessa's heart kicked. They backdated it. And if they did it once, they did it more than once. He pulled up another file. This one, all created recently, all dated to look like they were from years ago. Why would they do that? To build a paper trail. To make it look like they'd been operating in good faith all along, but they got lazy, and now we've got proof. Tessa stared at the screen. What do we do with this? Cross's smile was razor sharp. We bury them. The motion was filed the next morning. Spoliation of evidence, fraudulent documentation, obstruction of justice. Cross didn't just ask for sanctions. He asked for the entire lawsuit to be dismissed with prejudice and for the executives to be held in contempt. The judge scheduled an emergency hearing for the following week. The courtroom was packed. Media, patients, hospital staff who'd been fired or silenced or pushed out for asking the wrong questions. Tessa sat in the front row, hands folded in her lap, trying not to look at the executive sitting across the aisle. Gerald Roth looked smaller in person, older. His lawyers flanked him like bodyguards, whispering urgently, but he just stared straight ahead, jaw tight. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Honor Macklin, with a reputation for running a tight courtroom and zero tolerance for games. She reviewed the evidence in silence, flipping through page after page of metadata analysis, comparing dates, checking timestamps. Finally, she looked up. Mr. Vance, can you explain these discrepancies? Patricia Vance stood. Your Honor, the metadata reflects administrative updates, not document creation. These files were reformatted for production, which is standard practice. Reformatted how? Converted to PDF, updated for clarity. Judge Macklin's expression didn't change. And in the process of this reformatting, the creation dates were altered to appear years earlier than they actually were? Vance hesitated. That's a technical artifact, Your Honor. It doesn't reflect any intent to deceive. A technical artifact. The judge's tone could have cut glass. Counsel, I've been on the bench for 22 years. I know what a technical artifact looks like. This is not that. Vance opened her mouth, closed it. Judge Macklin set the papers down. The evidence before me suggests that documents were created recently and backdated to support a narrative that did not exist at the time of the alleged defamation. That's not reformatting, that's fabrication. The room went dead silent. Furthermore, the judge continued, the pattern of alteration is so pervasive that I have serious concerns about the integrity of this entire lawsuit. Therefore, I am granting the defendant's motion to dismiss with prejudice. Additionally, I am referring this matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution. Tessa felt the air leave her lungs. Vance was on her feet. Your Honor, we respectfully request denied. This case is dismissed. We're adjourned. The gavel came down. The courtroom erupted. Reporters bolted for the doors, cameras flashed. Somewhere behind Tessa, someone started clapping, and then others joined in, and within seconds the whole room was applauding. Tessa just sat there, staring at the bench, trying to process what had just happened. Cross leaned over. "You won." "We won," she said quietly. "No, you won. I just helped." Outside, the steps of the courthouse were swarmed, news crews, microphones. Questions shouted from every direction. Cross handled it, giving a brief statement about justice and accountability, while Tessa stood off to the side, trying to disappear. But then someone called her name. She turned. Nora was standing at the edge of the crowd, her father beside her. The girl was smiling, tears streaming down her face. Tessa pushed through the reporters and reached her, and Nora threw her arms around her, holding on like she was afraid to let go. "You did it," Nora whispered. "You actually did it." Tessa shook her head. "We did it." The general stepped forward, extended his hand. Tessa shook it, and he pulled her into a brief, tight embrace. "Thank you," he said. Tessa couldn't speak, just nodded. That night, the news covered it wall to wall. Major victory for whistleblower nurse Tessa Morgan. Healthcare executives face criminal charges after document fraud exposed. Judge calls lawsuit fabrication, dismisses case. Tessa watched it from her motel room, alone, with a cheap bottle of wine and a sense of unreality so strong she kept checking her phone to make sure it wasn't a dream. Her phone buzzed, a call from Dr. Ellison Cross. "Congratulations," Cross said. "Thank you. I meant what I said before. We need you on this task force, now more than ever." Tessa hesitated. "I don't know if I'm the right person." "You're exactly the right person. You proved that today." "I proved I could survive a lawsuit. That's not the same as knowing how to fix a system." Cross was quiet for a moment. "Tessa, the system doesn't get fixed by people who know all the answers. It gets fixed by people who refuse to accept the status quo. That's you." Tessa closed her eyes. "I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking." The call ended. Tessa sat there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle over her like a blanket. She'd won. The lawsuit was gone. The executives were facing charges. Wolf was in prison. The hospital was bankrupt. The patients were getting justice. But she didn't feel victorious. She felt empty. Her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something made her pick up. A voice she didn't recognize, female, calm, professional. "Miss Morgan, my name is Lauren Voss. I'm a senior investigator with the Department of Health and Human Services. I need to speak with you about Ironvale Medical Center." Tessa's stomach tightened. "I've already given statements multiple times." "I'm aware, but we've uncovered something new. Something that suggests the fraud at Ironvale was more extensive than we initially believed." "What do you mean?" Voss paused. "We found evidence that patient records were being altered, not just billing codes, actual medical charts, diagnoses, treatment notes. We think someone was systematically changing records to cover up malpractice and justify unnecessary procedures." Tessa's blood went cold. "Who?" "That's what we're trying to determine. But based on access logs, there's one name that keeps appearing." Tessa's hands were shaking. "Who?" "Dr. Adrian Wolf. But he's not the only one. There are at least 4 other physicians and 2 administrators involved. And Miss Morgan, your name appears in the access logs too." Tessa's heart stopped. "What?" "Your credentials were used to access and modify patient files multiple times over the course of 8 months." "That's impossible. I believe you, but someone used your login, and we need to figure out who and why and how many patients were affected." Tessa couldn't breathe. "How many are we talking about?" Voss's voice was grim. "At least 200, maybe more." The line went quiet. Tessa stared at the wall, feeling the ground open up beneath her. She thought it was over, thought she'd won. But she'd only scratched the surface. And somewhere in the ruins of Ironvale Medical Center, buried in the files and records and encrypted databases, was evidence that someone had been using her name to destroy lives she didn't even know about. Tessa's voice came out as a whisper. 200 patients. "At minimum," Voss said. "We're still analyzing the logs, but Miss Morgan, I need you to understand something. We don't believe you did this. The pattern of access doesn't match your work schedule. There are entries from times when you weren't even in the building. Someone cloned your credentials and used them as cover. Who? That's what we need to find out. Can you come in tomorrow? We need to walk through every file, every timeline, figure out who had access to your login information. Tessa's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Yeah, I'll be there. She hung up and sat in the dark motel room, staring at nothing. 200 patients? 200 people whose records had been altered while someone used her name. Every modification, every falsified note, every buried diagnosis, all of it tied back to her. She'd spent months fighting to clear her name, to prove she'd done the right thing, and now she was about to be dragged through it all over again. Her phone rang. Cross. You heard, he said. How did you? Voss called me first. Wanted to make sure you had counsel before she reached out. He paused. Tessa, this is bad, but it's also an opportunity. An opportunity to what? Get blamed for 200 more cases? An opportunity to find out who really ran this thing. Wolf's in prison, but he didn't do this alone. Someone with serious access, serious technical knowledge. They've been cleaning up evidence. And they made a mistake. They used your credentials because you were convenient, invisible, someone nobody would miss. But now we know. And now we dig. Tessa closed her eyes. I can't do this again. Yes, you can. Because if you don't, they win. And every record they altered, every patient they hurt, it all gets buried with you. She wanted to argue, wanted to hang up and disappear, but Cross was right, and they both knew it. Tomorrow, she said, I'll be there. The Department of Health and Human Services had an office in a federal building downtown that looked like every government facility Tessa had ever seen. Concrete, fluorescent lights, security checkpoints that took 20 minutes to clear. Voss met her in a conference room on the 8th floor, surrounded by boxes of printed logs and 3 monitors showing databases that looked like they'd been pulled from Iron Veil's servers. Voss was younger than Tessa expected, maybe early 40s, with sharp eyes and the kind of exhaustion that came from chasing cases that never seemed to end. Thanks for coming, Voss said. I know this isn't easy. Tessa sat down. Just show me what you found. Voss pulled up a spreadsheet. These are the access logs from Iron Veil's electronic health records system. Every time someone opens a file, modifies it, or saves changes, it gets logged with a timestamp and user ID. She highlighted a column. This is your user ID, and these are the entries that don't make sense. Tessa scanned the list. Entries at 3 a.m. on days she'd worked morning shifts. Modifications to patient files she'd never even heard of. Entire charts rewritten during hours she'd been home sleeping. Someone had my password, Tessa said. More than that. They had a way to spoof the system's audit trail. Normally, if you log in from 2 places at once, the system kicks you out. But these entries show simultaneous access from different terminals. That takes technical skill. Or inside help. Voss nodded. We think it's both. Someone in IT gave them access, and someone in administration told them which files to alter. Cross leaned forward. Do you have names? Not yet, but we're close. Voss pulled up another file. We cross-referenced the access times with badge swipes at the hospital. Only a handful of people were in the building during these late-night modifications, and one name keeps showing up. She turned the monitor. Tessa's breath caught. The name on the screen was Dr. Helen Vero, Chief Medical Officer at Iron Veil, the woman who'd stood next to the CEO during press conferences, promising transparency and accountability. The one who'd called Tessa's actions reckless on national television. She was there, Tessa whispered, every single time. Voss nodded. We pulled her email records, found communications with Wolf going back 5 years. They weren't just colleagues, they were coordinating. He'd flag cases that were high risk, patients who might sue, diagnoses that could expose malpractice, and she'd alter the records to make it look like everything had been handled correctly. Cross's voice was cold. How much did they make? Directly? Hard to say. But the hospital's billing increased by 40% in the departments they oversaw. We're talking tens of millions in fraudulent charges. Tessa felt sick, and they used my login to hide it. You were perfect cover. New, low level. If anyone ever audited the logs, they'd see your name and assume you'd made a mistake or acted without authorization. They never expected you to fight back. Tessa stared at the screen. at Vero's name, at the timestamps that lined up like evidence of a crime so calculated it made Wolf look like an amateur. "Where is she now?" Tessa asked. "We don't know. She resigned from Iron Vale 2 weeks after Wolf was arrested. Officially, she's consulting for a healthcare firm in Denver. Unofficially, we think she's preparing to run." Cross stood. "Then we need to move fast." Voss pulled out a phone. "I've got a warrant ready to go. We just need a judge to sign it." "How long?" "If we're lucky, by tonight." Tessa looked between them. "What do you need from me?" Voss met her eyes. "We need you to testify. Again. Grand jury this time. If we're going to build a case that holds up, we need someone who can walk the jury through how the system works, how records get altered, why it matters. You're the only one who can do that." Tessa's stomach twisted. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert." "You're the person who saw it first. That makes you the expert." The next 72 hours were a blur of preparation. Cross walked Tessa through potential questions, helped her organize the timeline, made sure she understood the legal framework. Voss brought in a forensic IT specialist who explained how the credential cloning worked, how someone could ghost log in as another user, how the audit trails could be manipulated without leaving obvious fingerprints. Tessa absorbed it all, took notes, asked questions until her head hurt. But underneath the preparation was a current of rage she couldn't quite suppress. They'd used her, turned her into a weapon against patients she'd never met, buried her name in crimes she hadn't committed. And they'd done it because they thought she was nobody, because they thought nobody would care. The warrant was signed at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, federal agents were surrounding a townhouse in Denver where Vero had been staying. Tessa watched the raid on a live feed in Voss's office. Agents in tactical gear, commands shouted through bullhorns. And then Vero, emerging in a bathrobe, hands raised, looking more annoyed than afraid, until they cuffed her. Then the fear showed. "She's lawyering up already," Voss said, watching the screen. "We've got maybe 48 hours before she stops talking." "Will she flip?" Cross asked. "If she's smart, yeah. But smart doesn't always win over ego." The grand jury was convened 3 days later in a sealed courtroom with no cameras, no media, just prosecutors and jurors and witnesses who spoke in low, careful voices. Tessa sat in the witness chair for 4 hours, walking them through the timeline. The scans she'd found, the notes that didn't match, the access logs that showed her credentials being used when she was nowhere near the hospital. The jurors listened, asked questions, took notes. One of them, an older woman with kind eyes, leaned forward. "Miss Morgan, why do you think they chose your login specifically?" Tessa thought about it. "Because I was invisible. I'd only been there 8 months. I didn't have connections or seniority or anyone who'd notice if something was off. If the logs ever got audited, my name would just look like an error, a junior nurse who didn't know better. But you did know better, eventually. But by the time I figured it out, they'd already used me to cover up years of fraud." The woman nodded slowly. "Thank you." When it was over, the lead prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Sandra Cho, pulled Tessa aside. "You did good. Did it help?" "We'll know soon." The indictment came down 72 hours later. Dr. Helen Vero was charged with healthcare fraud, conspiracy, falsification of records, and obstruction of justice. The warrant for her arrest was issued at 6 a.m. on a Thursday. She was picked up at the Denver airport boarding a flight to Sao Paulo with a one-way ticket. The arrest footage was everywhere by noon. Vero in handcuffs, flanked by federal agents, her lawyer shouting about illegal detention and procedural violations. She looked smaller on camera, older, her composure cracking as she was led through the terminal past travelers who stopped to record on their phones. Tessa watched it from Cross's office, feeling something hard and cold settle in her chest. "She was running," Cross said. "She knew we were coming. And she ran anyway. That's panic. That's guilt." He turned to her. "You know what this means, right? She's going to flip. She's going to give up everyone above her to save herself." Tessa looked at him. "How far up does this go?" "We're about to find out." Vero's lawyer reached out within 24 hours. His client was willing to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence and witness protection. The prosecution agreed, and Vero started talking. She gave them everything: names, dates, financial records, email chains. a network of complicity that stretched across the entire healthcare conglomerate, board members who'd known about the fraud and looked the other way, executives who'd created bonus structures that rewarded doctors for billing more, not treating better, compliance officers who'd been paid to ignore red flags, IT administrators who'd built the systems that allowed credential spoofing and audit trail manipulation. And at the center of it all, Gerald Roth, the CEO, who'd built an empire on exploitation and called it innovation. The indictments rolled out like dominoes: 12 executives, 6 board members, 4 compliance officers, 2 IT directors. Tessa watched the news coverage with a strange sense of detachment. These were people she'd never met, names she'd only seen in press releases and corporate headshots. But they'd shaped her life, destroyed her reputation, tried to bury her under lawsuits and lies. And now they were going down, one by one, because someone had finally decided to dig. Roth's arrest came on a Tuesday morning. Federal agents showed up at his estate in Virginia at dawn, cameras capturing every moment as he was led out in handcuffs, his lawyer already shouting about wrongful prosecution and selective enforcement. The board of directors voted to remove him that afternoon in a meeting that lasted less than an hour. His assets were frozen. His reputation, carefully constructed over decades, disintegrated overnight. Cross called Tessa that evening. "You see it?" "Yeah. How do you feel?" Tessa didn't answer right away. She was sitting in her apartment. She'd finally been able to afford one again, small, but hers, staring out the window at the city lights. "I don't know," she said finally. "I thought I'd feel something. Relief, maybe. But I just feel empty." "That's normal. You've been fighting for so long your body doesn't know how to stop." "When does it stop?" Cross was quiet for a moment. "When you decide it does." The trial for Gerald Roth and the other executives was scheduled for 8 months out. But Tessa didn't have to wait that long to see the impact. Patients started coming forward in droves. Not just from Ironvale, but from all 12 hospitals in the conglomerate. People who'd been overcharged, overtreated, misdiagnosed, or had their care delayed for financial reasons. The class action lawsuit that Cross had been building exploded into something massive. Over 3,000 plaintiffs claiming damages in the hundreds of millions. The conglomerate tried to fight it, hired a team of lawyers that could have filled a courtroom on their own, filed motions to dismiss, to separate the cases, to limit discovery. But the evidence was overwhelming. Billing records, emails, testimony from Vero and other cooperating witnesses. The patterns were undeniable. 6 months into discovery, the conglomerate's lawyers approached Cross with a settlement offer. $240 million distributed among the plaintiffs based on the severity of harm. Cross called Tessa. "They're offering to settle." "For how much?" He told her. She was silent for a long moment. "That's not enough," she said. "It's a starting point. We can negotiate. It's not about the money. It's about accountability. If they settle, they don't admit wrongdoing. They just write a check and move on." "Tessa, if we push this to trial, it could take years, and there's no guarantee we win." "What do the plaintiffs want?" "Most of them want the money. They've been waiting long enough." Tessa closed her eyes. "Then take the deal. But make sure part of it includes policy changes, mandatory reporting systems, protections for whistleblowers, independent audits, something that makes sure this doesn't happen again." "I'll push for it." The final settlement was announced 3 weeks later. $260 million, plus a requirement that all 12 hospitals implement comprehensive patient safety reforms within 18 months. Independent oversight, transparent billing, protections for staff who raised concerns. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Tessa was invited to the press conference where the settlement was announced. She stood in the back of the room, watching as lawyers and patient advocates spoke about justice and accountability and the importance of holding powerful institutions responsible. A reporter spotted her and called out, "Miss Morgan, do you feel vindicated?" Tessa hesitated, then stepped forward. "I feel like we made a start," she said. "The people responsible are being held accountable. The patients are getting compensation. The system is being forced to change. But vindication?" She shook her head. "I don't know if that's the right word, because no amount of money brings back the years people lost or the pain they went through or the trust that was broken. What I feel is hopeful. That maybe the next person who sees something wrong won't have to go through what I did to make it right. The room was quiet. Then another reporter asked, "What's next for you?" Tessa smiled, tired but genuine. "I'm going back to work." She'd gotten her nursing license reinstated 2 months earlier after completing the required ethics training and serving out her suspension. The nursing board had voted unanimously to clear her record, citing her cooperation with federal investigators and the exonerating evidence that showed she'd been framed. But Tessa didn't go back to floor nursing. Instead, she accepted a position with Dr. Ellison Cross's National Task Force on Medical Accountability. Her official title was Director of Nursing Advocacy, but what it really meant was that she spent her days traveling to hospitals, training staff on how to identify and report safety concerns, reviewing policies, and helping build systems that protected people who spoke up. It was exhausting. She was on the road 3 weeks out of every month, living out of hotels and rental cars, giving the same presentations over and over to audiences that ranged from enthusiastic to hostile. But it mattered. She could see it in the faces of the nurses who approached her after her talks, telling her they'd been in similar situations and hadn't known what to do. In the emails from hospital administrators who were genuinely trying to change their cultures. In the policies that were being rewritten to prioritize transparency over liability. 6 months into the job, she was invited to speak at a medical conference in Chicago. The panel was called Speaking Up, Protecting Patients in a Broken System, and she was the keynote. She'd almost said no. The idea of standing in front of hundreds of people, talking about what had happened, still made her stomach twist. But Cross had convinced her. So had Dr. Cross. So had Nora, who'd called the night before and said, "You have to. People need to hear this." The conference center was massive, all glass and steel and escalators that seemed to go on forever. Tessa found the ballroom where her panel was scheduled and stood in the hallway, trying to calm her nerves. A woman approached, maybe mid-50s, wearing scrubs and a name badge from a hospital in Minnesota. "Are you Tessa Morgan?" Tessa nodded. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted to say thank you. I've been a nurse for 30 years, and I saw something wrong at my hospital 6 months ago. A doctor who was cutting corners, putting patients at risk. And I reported it. I got suspended, investigated, almost fired. But I saw what you did, and it gave me the courage to keep fighting. They reinstated me last week, the doctor's under review, and I wanted you to know that what you did mattered." Tessa's throat tightened. "Thank you for telling me." The woman hugged her, quick and tight, then disappeared into the crowd. Tessa stood there for a moment, trying to pull herself together. Then she walked into the ballroom. It was packed. Every seat filled, people standing in the back. The panel moderator introduced her, and the room applauded as she walked to the podium. She looked out at the crowd, saw faces young and old, hopeful and exhausted, people who looked like they'd been through their own battles and weren't sure if they'd survived. She took a breath. "I'm not a hero," she started. "I know that's what some of the headlines said, that I'm brave or special or somehow different from everyone else in this room. But I'm not. I'm just a nurse who saw something wrong and didn't know how to stay quiet." She told them the story. Not the sanitized version, the real one. The fear, the retaliation. The night she'd been sure she'd made the worst mistake of her life. The moment she'd wanted to quit. "I broke the rules," she said. "I went over people's heads. I made enemies. And I got lucky. Because the patient I fought for survived. Because the evidence I found held up. Because the people who tried to bury me made mistakes." She paused. "But it could have gone differently. I could have been wrong. I could have been fired and lost everything and had nothing to show for it. And I need you to understand that before I say what I'm about to say next." The room was silent. Speaking up is terrifying. It's risky. It can destroy your career, your reputation, your life. The system is not built to protect people like us. It's built to protect itself. And when you challenge it, it will come after you with everything it has. She saw people nodding, saw some looking down, like they'd lived this. But here's the thing. If we don't speak up, if we see something wrong and stay silent because we're scared or tired or convinced it won't matter, then nothing changes. The patients keep suffering, the people in power keep winning, and we become part of the problem. Her voice was steady now, clear. "I'm not telling you to be reckless. I'm not telling you to throw your career away on a hunch. But I am telling you that you have more power than you think. You see things other people miss. You know when something's wrong, and your voice, quiet as it might feel, can change everything. She told them about the task force, about the new protocols being developed, about the hospitals that were restructuring their reporting systems to protect staff who raised concerns. None of that would have happened if I'd stayed quiet, she said. Not because I'm special, but because I refused to accept that this was just how things were. She looked out at the room, at the nurses in scrubs who'd probably come straight from a shift, at the students who looked terrified and hopeful at the same time. You're going to face moments where you have to choose between doing what's easy and doing what's right. And I can't promise it'll work out. I can't promise you won't get hurt. But I can promise you this: if you choose right, if you choose the patient, if you choose the truth, you'll be able to live with yourself. And that matters more than any job, any paycheck, any career. The room was silent for a long moment. Then someone started clapping, then another. Then the whole room was on their feet, applauding, and Tessa stood there, overwhelmed, trying not to cry. After the panel, she was swarmed. Nurses wanting to share their own stories, students asking for advice, hospital administrators handing her business cards and asking if she'd be willing to consult. She took the cards, listened to the stories, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than exhaustion. She felt purpose. 1 year later, Tessa stood in the lobby of a newly built hospital in Raven City. It wasn't Ironvale. That building had been sold off, gutted, turned into condos. This was something new, a facility designed from the ground up with patient safety as the core principle. Transparent reporting systems, protections for staff who raised concerns, a culture that treated nurses as partners, not subordinates. And on the wall in the main atrium was a plaque. The Nora Hale Patient Advocacy Center, dedicated to the principle that every voice matters and every patient deserves the truth. Nora was there for the unveiling, standing next to her father. She was in her second year of pre-med now, doing rotations at teaching hospitals, and already making a name for herself as someone who asked difficult questions and didn't accept easy answers. When she saw Tessa, she broke into a smile and rushed over. "You made it," Nora said. "Wouldn't miss it." They hugged, and Tessa pulled back to look at her. "How's school?" "Brutal, amazing, terrifying," Nora laughed. "Everything you said it would be." General Hale approached, shook Tessa's hand. "Good to see you." "You too, sir." He gestured to the plaque. Nora wanted this. Fought the board for 6 months to make it happen. Tessa looked at Nora. "You did this?" "We did this. All of us. But yeah, I pushed for it. Because people need to remember that change doesn't come from the top. It comes from people who refuse to stay quiet." The hospital's new CEO, a woman named Dr. Sarah Okafor, who'd spent 20 years as a trauma nurse before moving into administration, gave a speech about second chances and rebuilding trust. She talked about the failures of the past, the lessons learned, the commitment to doing better. "We can't undo what happened at Ironvale," Dr. Okafor said. "But we can make sure it never happens again, and that starts with listening. To our staff, to our patients, to the people who see problems before they become crises." She looked at Tessa. People like Tessa Morgan, who showed us that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and speaking up anyway. The room applauded. Tessa felt her face flush, but she smiled and nodded. After the ceremony, she stood outside, looking up at the building. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and people were streaming in and out, patients heading home, staff starting night shifts, families visiting loved ones. Her phone buzzed. A text from Daniel Cross. "Saw the news, proud of you." She smiled and typed back. "Thanks for everything. You did the hard part. I just kept you from drowning." Tessa put her phone away and took a breath. The air was cool, autumn creeping in, and for the first time in years she felt something close to peace. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Dr. Cross. "Can you talk?" Tessa answered. "Yeah, what's up?" "I'm putting together a team to testify before Congress. New legislation on patient safety protections. I want you there." Tessa's stomach tightened. "Dr. Cross, I don't know if I'm the right person for—" "You're exactly the right person, and I'm not asking you to do it alone. We'll have a whole team, but your voice matters, Tessa, more than you know." Tessa looked back at the hospital, at the plaque with Nora's name on it, at the people walking through the doors. Okay, she said. When do we start? Next month. I'll send you the details. The call ended. Tessa stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle over her. More testimony, more battles, more scrutiny, but also more change, more patients protected, more voices heard. She could do this. She'd done it before. 3 months later, Tessa sat in front of a Senate subcommittee on healthcare oversight. The hearing room was packed. Senators, lobbyists, media, patient advocates who'd traveled from across the country to watch. She'd prepared for weeks, reviewed the proposed legislation line by line, met with the other witnesses, practiced her testimony until she could recite it in her sleep. But when the committee chair called her name and she walked to the witness table, all the preparation fell away. It was just her, a microphone, and a room full of people waiting to hear what she had to say. She raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth. Then she sat down and began. My name is Tessa Morgan. 5 years ago, I was a floor nurse at Ironvale Medical Center in Raven City. I'd been there 8 months when I noticed something in a patient's medical file that didn't make sense. A 17-year-old girl who'd been blind since birth, but whose scans showed a treatable condition that had been missed, or ignored, for years. She walked them through the story, the resistance she'd faced, the retaliation, the lawsuits, the federal investigation that had uncovered systematic fraud affecting thousands of patients. I was lucky, she said. I had lawyers who believed me, investigators who did their jobs, a patient whose case was clear enough to prove I wasn't crazy, but I shouldn't have needed luck. I should have been able to report what I saw without fear of losing my career, my reputation, my life. She looked at the senators. The legislation you're considering today would create protections for healthcare workers who report safety concerns. It would require hospitals to investigate complaints instead of burying them. It would make retaliation a federal offense with real consequences. She paused. This won't solve everything, but it's a start. And it sends a message that the people who see problems and speak up aren't troublemakers. They're exactly what healthcare needs. One of the senators leaned forward. Miss Morgan, critics of this legislation say it would create a flood of frivolous complaints and make hospitals vulnerable to litigation. How would you respond to that? Tessa didn't hesitate. I'd say that hospitals are already vulnerable to lawsuits from patients who are harmed, to federal investigations when fraud is uncovered, to loss of public trust when scandals break. She met the senator's eyes. The question isn't whether complaints will increase. It's whether we want those complaints to be heard before patients get hurt or after. I know which one I'd choose. The senator nodded slowly. Another asked, what would you say to healthcare workers who are afraid to speak up? Tessa thought about the nurse in Minnesota, about the emails she got every week from people who'd seen something wrong and didn't know what to do. I'd say I understand, because I was terrified too. Every step of the way, I was convinced I was making a mistake, that I'd lose everything, that it wasn't worth it. She took a breath. But I'd also say that staying silent has a cost too. You have to live with knowing you could have helped someone and didn't, and that's a weight that doesn't get lighter with time. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Other witnesses testified, patient advocates, hospital administrators, healthcare lawyers. But when it was over, the media zeroed in on Tessa. Do you think the legislation will pass? A reporter asked. I hope so. But even if it doesn't, the conversation matters. We're talking about things that used to be buried. That's progress. What's next for you? Tessa smiled. I'm going back to work. The legislation passed 4 months later. It wasn't everything advocates had hoped for. There were compromises, amendments, carve-outs for certain situations. But it created baseline protections that hadn't existed before. Mandatory investigation procedures, anti-retaliation provisions, whistleblower protections with actual teeth. President signed it into law on a Tuesday afternoon. Tessa watched the ceremony from her office, surrounded by case files and coffee cups and sticky notes covering every surface. Dr. Cross called. We did it. You did it, Tessa said. I just showed up. You did a hell of a lot more than show up, and you know it. Tessa smiled. Yeah, maybe. That night, she got a call from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Miss Morgan? The voice was young, nervous. My name is Rachel Kim. I'm a nursing student in Seattle, and I just wanted to say thank you." Tessa's chest tightened. "For what?" "For showing me that it's possible. To stand up, to fight back, to make a difference, even when everything's against you." The girl's voice cracked. "I start my first clinical rotation next month, and I'm terrified. But I keep thinking about what you did, and it helps." Tessa didn't know what to say. "You're going to be great." "I hope so. I wanted you to know that what you did matters. It changed things. It changed me." The call ended. Tessa sat in the dark, phone still in her hand, trying not to cry. 2 years later, Tessa stood in the conference room of the National Patient Safety Foundation, looking at a wall covered in photos. Patients who'd been helped by the reforms. Healthcare workers who'd reported safety concerns and been protected instead of punished. Hospitals that had transformed their cultures. And in the center, a photo of Nora on the day she'd graduated medical school. Cap and gown. Huge smile. Her father standing next to her, looking like he might burst with pride. "Doctor," Cross walked in. "You ready?" Tessa turned. "For what?" "Board meeting. They're voting on the expansion proposal." The foundation had grown exponentially over the past 2 years. What had started as a small task force was now a national organization with offices in 12 states, training programs in over 200 hospitals, and a hotline that fielded thousands of calls from healthcare workers who needed advice, support, or just someone who understood. And they wanted to expand internationally. Partnerships with hospitals in Europe, Asia, South America. A global network dedicated to patient safety and staff empowerment. Tessa had been asked to lead the expansion, which meant more travel, more responsibility, more time away from anything resembling a normal life. But it also meant more impact, more people protected, more voices heard. "I'm ready," she said. The board voted unanimously to approve the expansion. Tessa was officially named International Director of Advocacy, effective immediately. That night, she went to dinner with Nora and General Hale at a small restaurant near the hospital where Nora was doing her residency. They talked about medicine, about the cases Nora was seeing, about the changes happening in healthcare. "You're doing incredible work," the general said to Tessa. "So is she," Tessa said, nodding at Nora. Nora smiled. "We learned from the best." They were quiet for a moment. Then Nora said, "Do you ever regret it? Everything that happened?" Tessa thought about it. About the lawsuits and the threats and the nights she'd been sure she wouldn't survive. About the career she'd almost lost and the life that had been torn apart and rebuilt. "No," she said finally. "Because if I'd stayed quiet, you'd still be blind. And 200 other patients would still be suffering, and nothing would have changed." She looked at Nora. "I can live with a lot of things, but I couldn't have lived with that." Nora's eyes were bright. "I'm glad you didn't." 5 years after everything started, Tessa stood in front of an audience of 10,000 people at an international healthcare conference in Geneva. She'd been invited as a keynote speaker, the final address of a week-long event focused on patient safety and healthcare reform. She walked onto the stage and the room rose to its feet, applauding before she'd even said a word. She waited for them to settle, then she began. "When I was 26 years old, I was nobody. A floor nurse 8 months into a job at a hospital where I was invisible. I had no power, no platform, no reason to believe that anything I did would matter." She told them the story one more time, but this time she didn't focus on the fear or the struggle. She focused on what had come after. "The system that tried to destroy me doesn't exist anymore," she said. "The hospital that fired me is gone. The executives who sued me are in prison. The policies that protected corruption have been rewritten, and the patients who were silenced have found their voices." She looked out at the audience. Doctors, nurses, administrators, patient advocates from 60 countries. None of that happened because I was special. It happened because I made a choice. And then other people made the same choice. And then more people. And slowly, one voice became 100. 100 became 1,000. And 1,000 became a movement. Her voice was strong now, clear. "You don't need power to change things. You don't need permission. You just need the courage to say what you see, even when everyone tells you to stay quiet. Especially then." She paused. "I was told I didn't know my place, that I should stay in my lane, that I was too junior, too inexperienced, too insignificant to question people above me." She smiled. They were wrong. And if someone's telling you the same thing, if you're being told that your voice doesn't matter, that you should let someone else handle it, that speaking up will only make things worse, I want you to remember this. She looked directly into the camera recording the speech, knowing it would be watched by millions. The system doesn't change because powerful people decide to fix it. It changes because ordinary people refuse to accept it. Because nurses and techs and students and patients decide that enough is enough. Because one person sees something wrong and says it out loud, and that gives the next person permission to do the same. The room was silent, hanging on every word. I didn't save anyone by myself. I just started a conversation that other people were brave enough to continue. And that's what I'm asking you to do. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't wait for someone else to go first. Her voice dropped, but the microphone carried it to every corner of the hall. See something. Say something, and don't let anyone convince you that staying silent is safer, because it's not. Not for you, and definitely not for the people counting on you to speak up. She stepped back from the podium. The room exploded. Standing ovation. Applause that went on for minutes. People crying, cheering, holding up phones to record the moment. Tessa stood there, overwhelmed, trying to take it all in. This was what she'd fought for. Not the applause, not the recognition, but the proof that it had mattered, that the choice she'd made, the terrifying, reckless, impossible choice to speak up when everyone told her not to, had rippled out into something bigger than she could have imagined. After the speech, she was swarmed by people wanting to talk, to share their own stories, to ask for advice. She stayed for hours, listening, answering questions, connecting people with resources. Finally, exhausted, she slipped out a side door and found a quiet courtyard where she could breathe. Her phone buzzed. A text from Cross. Watch the live stream. You're a rock star. She smiled and typed back. I'm a tired rock star. Best kind. She sat down on a bench and closed her eyes, feeling the cool evening air on her face. Her phone rang. She answered without looking at the screen. Tessa Morgan. Miss Morgan, this is Dr. James Rothwell. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at a hospital in Toronto. I was at your keynote today, and I wondered if you might have time to discuss some changes we're trying to implement. Tessa opened her eyes. What kind of changes? The kind that require someone to tell us the truth, even when it's hard to hear. She smiled. I think I can do that. They talked for 20 minutes. Then she hung up and sat in the quiet, watching the lights of Geneva spread out below. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email. Subject line, thank you. She opened it. Dear Miss Morgan, you don't know me, but I'm a nurse in Australia who just reported a medication error that my supervisor told me to cover up. I was terrified. But I watched your speech and I did it anyway. They're investigating now. I might lose my job, but I know I did the right thing. Thank you for showing me that was possible. Tessa read it twice. Then she wrote back. You're going to be okay. And you did the right thing. If you need help, reach out. You're not alone. She sent it and sat there, staring at the screen. This was it. This was what mattered, not the headlines or the lawsuits or the legislation. But the moments like this, the people finding their courage because someone else had gone first. She'd been invisible once. Nobody. A nurse who didn't matter. But she'd been wrong about that. Because in a system built to keep people quiet, one voice had been enough to start a fire. And that fire was still burning. Years later, when people asked Tessa how she'd done it, how she'd taken on a system designed to crush her and won, she always gave the same answer. I didn't do it alone. And I wasn't special, I just refused to believe that being powerless meant I couldn't do anything. She'd smile. Turns out, that's all it takes. One person who decides that silence costs too much. And then another, and another, until the quiet turns into a roar that can't be ignored. Because, in the end, that was the truth. She hadn't changed the world by being powerful. She'd changed it by refusing to stay silent. And somewhere, right now, someone else was making that same choice. Seeing something wrong, saying something true, risking everything. Because one voice, quiet, uncertain, afraid, can change everything. If you're brave enough to use it.